part 4. We got up to part 3. Understanding the client. When you're pricing something, whether it's a grant or a tender, over time, you develop an instinct around that client. So if it's a grant, you get to understand a little bit of how flexible they can be with their budgets. You can begin to understand a little bit about what their daily rates might be that they would allow, or that maybe they'll allow, say, awards to makerspaces or awards to makers, where some clients won't. But you develop an instinct around the client. It does take time, and you can find ways to engage with the client, to discuss ideas with them, to help them figure out how sensitive they are to price. One of the big areas is it niche market or mass market? And this again applies to tenders or grants. So if it's a very niche area, say high-end movie props or movie set design or something, where it's a one-off job, it's incredibly niche, because it's for that particular production. It might be a big industry, but if it's for that particular client or something, you can do something that's you can price it differently. You can price higher potentially. Or if it's mass market, where basically the differentiator is cost. It's something that will be sold in a supermarket. It's something you're competing in a public procurement process against lots of other people also submitting tenders. Or potentially, if it's a public grant, where you're competing against lots of other NGOs, somehow that's mass market. A niche market might be, say, a billionaire who has an idea, who has a personal foundation. They're perhaps less sensitive to price and more interested in effectiveness. So that's another way to think about understanding the client is this a niche or mass market? Understanding the competition and what they charge. I guarantee you, if you're competing against other aid organizations, which is my experience and what you may be facing as well, you will probably be charging less than what the competition charges. So if you're competing against UNICEF or GIZ or hubs, accelerators, startups, they'll probably be charging more than what you do. That gives you an opportunity to increase your price and to make sure that you're properly compensated. Now, that might make the project shorter if it's a fixed amount, but if it's a tender, you can increase your prices. You absolutely cannot engage in price fixing, because if you do that, you and everybody else involved in it will never be allowed to contract and tender again. But you get a bit of a sense of what the client sees the market as. So particularly around day rates and labor, you get a bit of a sense of what people expect. So that does build up over time. And again, it's about being sort of open and with the client, with the donor, and talking to people. Be very careful about pricing low with the hope that you might win more work in the future, because essentially what you're doing is locking in that low price, because you set the expectation that you will be able to always work for that low price. So be careful about that. And it might actually be, I've seen businesses, I've seen NGOs do this. They see it as a loss leader. But the loss leader is often because you're trying to upsell on some other product, right? So you have your very cheap Samsung phone relatively cheap Samsung phone because you're making money off of all the data you're selling to the advertisers, that Android system sort of thing. Or you have a cheap printer, but the ink is incredibly expensive. So that, you can't use one without the other. You can't really do that in the makerspace world necessarily. You can't say, well, these days of labor are going to be at this much, but as soon as you go to this point, then you're going to start charging so much more. It's quite hard to make that case. So be very careful about pricing low in the hope of winning future work. It's a strategy, but you've got to, I would generally advise against it. I think, making sure that you go in with a clear offer and justification for that offer and sticking to it, at least for the next year, is the best idea.